They dragged him out of his car, slammed him with false charges, until he exposed who he really was. Late at night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the streets were mostly quiet, save for the occasional hum of traffic lights flickering from red to green. Jamal Winslow, a seasoned assistant U.S. attorney, had just left a dinner with colleagues. He wasn't thinking about work, injustice, or courtrooms, just home. That changed the moment he saw flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Sighing, he signaled, pulled over, and reached for his wallet. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't run a light. There was no reason for a stop. But he knew better than to assume reason had anything to do with it. Two officers approached his window. Officer Kyle Driscoll, tall, broad, with a military cut, stood at the driver's side. Officer Brent Kessler, leaner but no less imposing, hovered near the passenger door. "License and registration," Driscoll said, his voice clipped. Jamal handed over his documents. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Driscoll glanced at Kessler before answering.
"Your tail light is out."
Jamal frowned. That was a lie. His car had just passed inspection, and he could see in the rearview mirror that his brake lights were fully functional. "Are you sure about that?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice even. Driscoll's expression shifted, just slightly. He leaned in.
"Sir, step out of the vehicle. À slow tension, crêpe trou Jamal Eslin."
He had prosecuted cases like this before, where a routine stop became something far worse. His instinct told him to comply, but his experience told him these officers were already escalating.
"I'm not stepping out until you tell me why."
Kessler smirked, resting his hand on his belt. "Because we said so." Jamal took a breath.
"Ik knew the law."
He had spent years studying, enforcing, and defending it. He knew he didn't have to get out of the car unless there was probable cause. "I'm within my rights to ask why I'm being ordered out of my car." Driscoll's patience snapped. He yanked the door open. "Step out. Now." Before Jamal could react, Driscoll grabbed his wrist and yanked him forward. The seatbelt caught across his chest, digging into his shoulder.
"What the hell are you doing?"
Jamal barked, instinctively pulling back. Driscoll didn't answer. He just grabbed harder. Within seconds, Kessler was on the other side, wrenching Jamal's arm behind his back. The sharp edge of metal cuffs dug into his skin. "You're resisting," Driscoll said coldly. Jamal stared in disbelief as Kessler pressed him against the hood of his own car. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from rage. This was a game. A setup. And they thought they had already won. But they were about to realize just how wrong they were. The courtroom in East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse was packed. The air was thick with routine, clerks shuffling papers, the occasional cough, the quiet hum of whispered conversations. But beneath that, something else simmered. Jamal Winslow sat at the defense table, posture rigid but composed. He wasn't here as an attorney today. He was the defendant. The charges?
Resisting arrest. Obstruction. Disorderly conduct. Complète fabrication.
But Jamal already knew, truth didn't matter. Only what could be proven. At the front of the room, Judge Margaret Holloway peered down from the bench. In her mid-60s, she had the kind of presence that commanded authority, whether it was earned or not. Her reputation, firm, uncompromising, dismissive of nonsense. And from the way she barely looked at him, Jamal already knew where this was going. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, walked with confidence, the kind born from knowing the odds were in his favor. He straightened his tie and nodded to the officers sitting proudly at the witness stand. Jamal watched as Driscoll and Kessler sat smugly, knowing they had the full weight of the system behind them. "Your Honor," Calloway began, "this is a simple case of an individual escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical altercation with law enforcement."
Jamal exhaled slowly. "The arrogance. The audacity."
Calloway continued, flipping through his notes. The defendant refused to comply with officers' lawful orders, became aggressive, and had to be restrained for the safety of all involved. Jamal's lawyer, Thomas Rivera, an overworked and underpaid public defender, shot up from his chair. Objection. There is zero evidence that my client was aggressive. Judge Holloway waved a hand dismissively. Overruled. Jamal clenched his jaw. That was fast. Too fast. Rivera sighed but pressed forward. Your Honor, the officers escalated the situation without just cause. There is no body cam footage showing my client acting aggressively, because no such footage exists. Calloway smirked. Body cams were not operational at the time of the arrest. But the officers' statements are more than enough evidence.
Jamal almost looked at the absurdity.
The officer's word was all they needed? Convenient. Driscoll took the stand first, delivering his well-rehearsed lines. The defendant was combative from the start, he said smoothly. He refused to exit the vehicle, raised his voice, and created a hostile situation. Lies. Every word. Kessler followed, nodding in agreement as he added, he tensed up. We feared for our safety. We had no choice but to restrain him. More lies.
Jamal Esfinger curled into fist bonnet at the table.
He had spent his entire career fighting against this kind of blatant corruption, and now he was living it firsthand. Judge Holloway barely hid her impatience as she glanced at Rivera.
Anything else, Monsieur Rivera? Rivera hesitated.
He knew this judge. Knew her record. Knew she wasn't interested in fairness. Still, he swallowed hard and pushed forward.
Yes, Your Honor.
The defense calls Jamal Winslow to the stand. This was it. As Jamal rose and walked to the witness stand, he could feel every pair of eyes on him, watching, judging, waiting to see if he would break. But he wouldn't. Because what was about to happen would change everything. He sat in the witness chair, exhaling slowly as the court clerk swore him in. His hands rested lightly on his lap, but inside, he was simmering. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. Prosecutor Calloway stepped forward, pacing slightly, a show of confidence more than necessity. Mr. Winslow, would you say you complied with the officer's instructions during your traffic stop? Jamal met his gaze, calm, controlled. I asked why I was being ordered out of my car. That's not illegal. Calloway feigned a sigh. You refused to exit, correct? I asked why I was being asked to step out, Jamal repeated, which legally I have the right to do. Calloway smirked, glancing at the jury as if Jamal's intelligence were an inconvenience. And after multiple orders, you still didn't comply. Jamal held his stare. Because there was no lawful reason to. Calloway turned to the judge, shaking his head with exaggerated disbelief. Your Honor, it's clear the defendant. Before we go any further, Jamal said, his voice even as he leaned forward, I should probably disclose something.
Silence. Calloway hesitated.
Even Judge Holloway looked up, actually looked at him, for the first time. Jamal reached into his briefcase. His lawyer, Rivera, tensed, uncertain of what was happening. Slowly, Jamal pulled out his badge, a small, simple rectangle that had suddenly become the most dangerous object in the room. I'm Jamal Winslow, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District.
The room froze.
Judge Holloway's lips parted slightly, her gavel hovering above her desk but unmoving. The officers stiffened. Kessler's knee bounced under the table. Driscoll's jaw tightened. Calloway's face went pale.
Excuse-me. Calloway stammered.
Jamal tilted his head. Did I stutter? The air shifted. The jury leaned forward. The stenographer stopped typing. Even Rivera looked like he'd been hit by a freight train. You're a federal prosecutor? Calloway's voice wavered, just slightly. Jamal lifted his ID. That's what this says, doesn't it? And just like that, the entire case imploded. Judge Holloway sat back, her mouth pressing into a thin line. She knew, if she ruled against Jamal now, if she dismissed his testimony and sided with those officers, this wouldn't just be another forgotten case. It would be a scandal. The courtroom wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a powder keg. And Jamal had just lit the fuse. No one moved.
No one breathed.
Judge Holloway's grip on her gavel tightened, but she didn't slam it down. Not yet. She was thinking. Calculating. This wasn't just a routine case anymore. This was a career-ending disaster waiting to happen. Calloway swallowed hard. The confidence, the smooth arrogance he had worn so easily, was gone. He turned to the officers, and for the first time, Driscoll and Kessler looked nervous.
Jamal sat there, calm, watching the silent scramble for control.
He had seen this kind of panic 100 times before, in boardrooms, in back offices, in hushed conversations between prosecutors, when the wrong kind of case landed on the wrong desk. But this time, he was the one who forced their hand. I wasn't aware of this information, Calloway stammered, flipping through his files like a man searching for an escape hatch.
Your Honor,
Judge Holloway raised a hand, cutting him off. For the first time, her eyes locked onto Jamal's. His presence alone was now a threat, a government prosecutor, wrongfully arrested, assaulted, and lied about. Had this gone unnoticed, he could have become just another nameless statistic. And she knew it. She turned to the officers.
Driscoll, Kessler.
Both men sat up straight like children bracing for punishment. Would you like to amend your statements?
Silence.
A crack in their composure. Driscoll's fingers curled tightly around his knee.
Kessler glanced at Calloway, clearly searching for a lifeline.
Jamal leaned forward. Before they answer that, Your Honor, I'd like to request that the court pull the dispatch call logs from the night of my arrest.
Calloway flinched.
Jamal wasn't guessing. He knew exactly how this worked. If the officers had radioed in before the stop, their lie about the broken taillight wouldn't hold. If they hadn't, then they had violated protocol from the very beginning. Judge Holloway studied him. She was trapped. If she denied the request, she'd be accused of burying evidence. If she approved it, she was handing Jamal the final nail in the coffin. She cleared her throat.
Request granted.
Driscoll exhaled sharply, his composure finally cracking. Kessler shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched. They knew what was coming. Jamal leaned back in his seat. And he wasn't done. Because this case wasn't going to stay inside this courtroom. It started with a single reporter in the back. A young journalist from the Baton Rouge Advocate, furiously typing on her laptop. Within hours, the story began to spread. By the next morning, Jamal's name was everywhere. Assistant U.S. Attorney wrongfully arrested by Baton Rouge cops. Federal prosecutor exposes corrupt officers in open court. Judge under fire for bias against black defendant, who was a government lawyer. The internet erupted. Social media flooded with clips from inside the courtroom, secretly recorded by attendees. The moment Jamal revealed his badge became a viral video, spreading across platforms like wildfire. Cable news stations ran back-to-back segments on the case's implications. How many others had been railroaded like Jamal, but without the power or position to fight back? But the biggest shift happened in Baton Rouge itself. Community activists organized rallies.
Protester Gatreduzzi de Courtouz, demanding accountability.
Civil rights attorneys began digging into Judge Holloway's old cases, searching for patterns of racial bias.
And then, the real blow landed.
An anonymous leak. Internal police records. Emails between officers discussing how to justify questionable stops. Statements from other black drivers who had been pulled over, cited for false violations, then threatened with arrest if they dared argue. This case wasn't just about Jamal Winslow anymore. It was about a system, one that had been operating in the shadows for years. And now, the floodlights were on. But the people in power weren't going down without a fight. The backlash was immediate. City officials scrambled. The Baton Rouge Police Department issued a carefully worded statement. And Judge Holloway's office stopped returning calls altogether. By the end of the week, the department announced an internal investigation. A weak, performative gesture Jamal had seen too many times before.
À distraction.
A way to pacify the public without making real changes. But this time, it wasn't enough. The pressure kept building. A civil rights attorney filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of past victims. Community leaders demanded Judge Holloway be removed from the bench. Protesters refused to back down.
And then, the real moment of reckoning came.
The case was officially handed over to Louisiana's Attorney General for review. Jamal sat alone in his apartment, watching the press conference on TV. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from journalists, lawyers, and strangers who had lived through exactly what he had. But unlike him, they didn't have a badge to fight back. This wasn't just damage control anymore. They were running out of ways to hide.
And Judge Holloway.
She knew it. By the time Jamal returned to court for the verdict, her demeanor had shifted.
No more casual disinterest.
No more overconfidence. She was staring down a case too big to bury. Now, she had to decide which side of history she wanted to land on. But would it be real justice? Or just another calculated move to protect the system? The courtroom was silent. Judge Holloway cleared her throat. The weight of the past few weeks sat heavy on her shoulders. The protests.
The media scrutiny.
The leaked documents. She had no good options left. She looked down at her notes, but everyone in the room knew. This decision wasn't just hers anymore. It was the public's. She exhaled, setting her gavel down softly. After reviewing the evidence, she began, "The court finds the defendant." She paused.
Juste for a moment. Not guilty.
A wave of relief surged through Jamal's chest. But he didn't move. Didn't react. Not yet. Because this case had never been just about him. Across the aisle, the officers sat frozen. Their faces pale. Kessler's hands were clenched into fists, his career flashing before his eyes. Driscoll, always the more arrogant of the two, leaned forward.
Your Honor, oui. Judge Holloway raised a hand.
The court will also be forwarding all relevant materials to the state attorney's office for further review. And just like that, it was over. The officers weren't walking away from this. The courtroom erupted. Murmurs. Gasps. The rapid click of reporters' keyboards. For the first time in a long time, the system had turned its gaze inward.
Jamal stood slowly.
His lawyer patted his back, but Jamal's eyes were locked on the officers. On Calloway, who looked like he'd just lost everything. On the judge, who had spent years dismissing cases like his, until she had no choice but to act differently. But most of all, Jamal thought of the people who weren't in that room. The ones who had sat in that very spot before him.
The ones who never got to walk free.
As he stepped out of the courtroom, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. People cheered. But Jamal wasn't celebrating. Because this wasn't a victory. It was proof. Proof of what had always been happening. Only now, with the world watching, had the system been forced to react. And he knew.
The fight wasn't over.
Not for him.
Not for the people still trapped in it.
He stepped past the flashing lights and into the crowd, where voices were demanding real change. Because one case wasn't enough. And now, nobody was looking away. If this story made you think, even for a second, then ask yourself, how many more stories like this are out there? How many people never get their moment in court? Their names never make the news. Their truth never gets heard. It's not enough to just see injustice. We have to challenge it.
Soifiu believ real justice min solding power accountable.
Share this story. Talk about it. Pay attention. Because the more people who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for these cases to be swept under the rug. And that's how change begins.